And we're live. It is Wednesday, June 10th, 2020, 5 o'clock p.m. Kate, you have the monologue today.
Yeah. So I was thinking yesterday when Larry was talking, and this is going to seem like a crazy little rant, but I don't know if you've ever watched Swiss Family Robinson, the live action Disney version from like 1960. Have you watched it? Matt, did you watch it when you were growing up?
I watched it many times when I was growing up. We had the tape.
Yes, we had the tape too. In fact, I think my brother and I ruined the tape watching it so many times. That and like the Apple Dumpling Gang. Anyways, there's like a whole thing. But anyways, there's something that I loved about the Swiss Family Robinson, which was like I loved this kind of like can-do spirit, and like they built this beautiful tree fort, and it had all of these like they made all of these modern things work, like running water, and like they were helped by a baby elephant. I think that everyone would be helped by a baby elephant, but like they were in particular helped by a baby elephant. And there was all of this kind of like loveliness. I am literally sitting right now, like my partner is making fun of me because he's like, you built a little house outside the house. I made like a tent. I bought a tent and like put it on 4 walls to like be around a stand around desk so that I can keep all of my electronic office equipment safe and keep it outside and actually be working outside almost all the time, so I don't have to move everything inside. In the spirit of Swiss Family Robinson to a certain extent, I think. I also have like a little actual fire right here. But anyways, there's one thing that like drove me absolutely batshit no matter how many times I watched Swiss Family Robinson. And this was that they like tried twice to get off the goddamn island, and then they just gave up. Okay. They like literally built like one raft and it hit some rocks, and they're like, oh, rafts don't work. Never going to try a raft. I'm like, move your launch point, dude. Move your fucking launch point and just like go around the rocks or to a better place and do something else. Or like, I don't know, build a stronger raft that doesn't break apart when you like it runs into rocks. So this was this thing that has kind of bothered me, and I found it to be this weird metaphor that I've been using about politics and Section 230 and the administration, which is just like,
you just went from Swiss Family Robinson to Section 230.
I told you that no one was going to understand this metaphor except for me.
No. I'm digging that.
But like, it's actually kind of like it's a way of, I've never understood this. Like, do not become complacent in your circumstances and build yourself a cozy little cabin in a tree. Like, keep trying to get off the freaking island. Like, keep going. Like, if they had built the cabin and then kept going with like from their like perch of like comfort, but they don't. They build the cabin and just are like, we're going to be here forever. This is our life now. And I just kind of think that this was a little bit of Larry's talk yesterday. Larry kind of was like, we need to have people that are willing to upset the entire system, who are just like not okay continuing to go along with the fact that like some of us are living in this treehouse and some of us aren't, and like that none of this is great and we're all stuck on this island that we can't make it better. And they like, you just use the scientific method, build a bunch of different types of boats and try to get off the island and study tide charts. And I don't know, like basically I just feel like if you can build indoor plumbing with a baby elephant, you should be able to get off the island. And therefore Section 230, this entire idea of throwing it out, everything else about it, it just seems like make the entire system better. Don't just kind of get rid of everything that we were trying to, that didn't like loop around the way I thought it was going to. But I'm gonna stick with baby elephants and I'm gonna end there.
Well, so I missed the thing yesterday, but some people want to build rafts to get off the islands, and others want to make bombs out of coconuts and dig pits with tigers in them.
Yes, do you remember the coconut bombs?
Of course, that's the part I remember most as a little boy watching. Maybe they don't want to get off the island. Maybe they just want to kill pirates.
Yeah, like actually it's kind of like a good point. So like I kind of think that some people do like there's just like I'm trying to figure out what the exact there's so much about that movie that feels deeply relevant right now for some reason or another, and I can't like overlay it perfectly onto any one moment. But it just like, yeah, that's a great example. The coconut bombs. Oh, I remember those so deeply. Also, I remember really horribly.
So the more I hear you talk, the more I hear you both talk about this, the more convinced I am that I've never seen this movie.
Yeah, you'd remember. You'd remember the tiger eating the pirates at the end.
Yeah, sure. And they fall. There is actually one really. Do you remember the really gruesome pit that had like sharpened bamboo?
Yeah.
I remember being like, oh, that's actually pretty violent, like for this movie, besides the tiger eating them. Anyways, also there's a really annoying helpless lady that drove me nuts. But I digress. In any event, we're not allowed to have fun anymore. But in lieu of fun, we have Matt Miller. Thank you so much for coming on the show. And mostly, I'm very pleased that you understood my reference to Swiss Family Robinson. Because I feel like I just would have been really, really awkward hanging out here with this reference.
Right, if nobody got it.
Since Ben didn't get it, yeah, somebody.
Right, I mean, it would have sucked if there weren't anybody who got the reference.
Right.
So
thanks for having me. Very glad to be here.
So Matt, for those of you who don't know him, was the spokesman for the Justice Department during the Obama administration. He he was also worked for Schumer and had a long career on the Hill before going to the Justice Department. And I think the best way to describe Matt these days is as an appalled Justice Department wit. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think that's pretty good.
I mean, like he's funny. He's kind of a humorist about it, but without ever taking the edge off how awful it is. And so a lot of us who are in that same sort of broad camp, which is to say, believers in apolitical law enforcement, and kind of believers that the Justice Department should be at least mostly apolitical, save for certain policy priorities that shift with administrations. There's it's kind of a group of people who are kind of DOJ watchers who comment on it from this point of view of, I don't know, appalled gawking is kind of like, you can't, it's like rubbernecking. You can't take your eyes off of it, even though you're slowing traffic. And Matt is like the person who does this on Twitter basically full time. So today is a good day to discuss this because we have Judge John Gleason's brief, which shows up today.
How is it?
Well, let's start with that, Matt. Have you read it, and what did you think?
So I haven't read the entire thing. I read the summary. I read the opening. I read the kind of key stuff at the end. I've skimmed the rest of it. I thought it was a pretty devastating takedown. Both of the kind of like the ins and outs of the legal position that the department took.
So this is in the Flynn case. Give us a little bit of background for those who aren't
sure.
up on it.
So obviously Mike Flynn, the former national security advisor for I think 17 days or something at the beginning of the administration, pled guilty to lying to the FBI, was set to be sentenced for lying to the FBI, then had something of a change of heart, fired his counsel, hired a new counsel who's a kind of Fox News gadfly, who started coming and making representations to the court that, he didn't really lie. He was, I'm grossly oversimplifying, but he was entrapped into this by the FBI. And his counsel lost ruling after ruling after ruling from the judge until suddenly the Justice Department came in and reversed its position and said that the charges ought to be dismissed against him. And when I say the Justice Department, I think it's important to say it wasn't the people in the Justice Department who had brought the case previously. It wasn't the line prosecutors. It was a U.S. attorney, temporary U.S. attorney who was put in place by Bill Barr, clearly, I think, taking directions from Barr, who came in and urged the judge to dismiss the case. Usually when that happens, the judge just dismisses the case. In this instance, the judge, who is, I think most federal judges are fairly independent. This federal judge is one of the most independant and, let's say, cantankerous
the word
judges.
Cantankerous comes to mind.
Yeah, cantankerous.
Really? Wait,
yeah.
really?
I was at
Judge Sullivan.
He's great. Look, I was at DOJ when we moved to dismiss the charges against Ted Stevens, and we.
Do you know I covered that like every day of that trial?
Yeah. So you remember him,
but also
DOJ,
the FBI really fucked up there.
They did really fuck up, and we sort of thought that.
Do you remember the juror who like took off for a horse race?
Yeah, I'd forgotten about that part. The trial was before my time. The trial was it's oddly. I was working for Schumer at the Democratic Senatorial Campaign Committee, trying to beat Ted Stevens, so paying close attention to the trial, but from a political side. But then came into the department, and Holder made the decision to dismiss that case. And Sullivan didn't let us just dismiss it, as you both know. He appointed an independent counsel attorney. I don't know what you'd call him to come.
I think it was a special master.
Special master, maybe, yeah, to come and investigate whether the line prosecutors ought to face charges. So he's very independent, pretty cantankerous, especially when he feels he's been misled by DOJ. And I think he felt he was.
That was a shitty. Are you talking about the Stevens case, or are you talking about? Yeah, that was like. I mean, there was some like the whole claim there, right? Sorry, not to like totally digress, but for 1 second, because it's kind of interesting and fun color, like because Ted Stevens was this he was chair of Energy and Commerce. He had a ton of connections. He was basically investigated. He and Don Young both who is the congressperson from Alaska, were investigated by the FBI multiple times for like kind of like taking stuff under the table. They had like salacious like hotel room meetings with people where they like took like bags of money, and then but when it came down to building the case from the FBI after years of investigation, it got tainted because like the FBI, two FBI members had ended up having an affair and like falling in love with each other and like not like doing all of this weird cross dealing. And then there had been like, they didn't really actually find that much money. Like he'd gotten like a ton, like a giant $20,000 copper statue of a salmon, for example, from like
and home renovations
and a lot of home renovations. Okay, like I'm not saying that it definitely didn't happen, but it just wasn't like, it kind of wasn't at the scale that like I think people were anticipating. It would definitely happened. It was definitely shady dealings. And then on top of that, the case just ended up being completely insane because one of the jurors disappeared for 3 days and said that her like family member was dying, and like they put in an alternate and all of this stuff. And it turned out she'd gone to the horse races and was like photographed being at the horse races, and Judge Sullivan like ripped her a new one. Oh my God. It was just, anyways, the whole thing was like, it was out of a soap opera.
Yeah, it was a messy case in the beginning, and he was found guilty. He had asked for a speedy trial so he could
I remember
have his name cleared before election, and in turn, I think he was found guilty something like a week, 10 days before the election that he subsequently lost. And the issue in the case was that the FBI, all the other issues you mentioned, but the big part had been the FBI and the prosecutors had not turned over evidence to the senator's defense team, and Judge Sullivan was pretty torqued off about that. And
yeah, that's all I remember is how angry he was.
Yeah, he was
also,
really
you have
off.
to remember this was also the year that McCain was up for election, and he had named Sarah Palin as his running mate, and so it was just like this crazy shit show coming out of Alaska from every direction. It was just like very nuts. And Alaska was my beat.
You've seen. Go ahead, Ben.
No, please.
I was gonna say, it's funny how Flynn's new defense team has tried to play on Sullivan's proclivities to get angry at the government when they're withholding information from defense attorneys and try to allege that that's what has happened in this case. And he just hasn't gone for it
right,
at all.
But let's pause over that, because Sidney Powell must think that Emmett Sullivan is, in addition to being cantankerous, an idiot. Because, her basic contention is that the government withheld all this information that Jim Comey, with Pete Strzok, like feeding dog treats to Pete Strzok under his desk, is sitting there rubbing his hands with glee and ordering, like, and now we will set him up so that he'll lie. And Andy McCabe is there like, okay, I'll call him and we're gonna get him to lie. And the whole thing makes absolutely no sense. And I thought Gleason's brief today actually did a really good job of, like, going through the record and showing how little sense it made. And I think that, like, the DC Circuit is going to hear this crazy mandamus case on this on Friday. And, I wonder, does this brief that kind of lays out the whole record change the way this presents to the DC Circuit from a, is this judge out of control, refusing to dismiss a case that the Justice Department wants to dismiss? Does it change the optics of it to, holy shit, the Justice Department really is being corrupt here and really is acting in a corrupt fashion to help a friend and confidant of the president. And there is exactly one thing that stands between that and success, and it is Judge Emmett Sullivan, for all his eccentricities. And the record actually is awful on this. So what do you think? Does Sullivan respond to this by, basically taking this brief as a script? And does the DC Circuit, it's a very Trump-friendly panel, does it get a little bit chastened by this?
Rao is on that panel, right?
Rao and Henderson.
Rao and Henderson, yeah.
So it's like it's as good a panel as you could get from a Trump perspective.
Yeah, that's kind of the point I was making. Look, it ought to worry them and embarrass them. I think I'm glad you used the word corrupt, because in addition to kind of being, I thought, a devastating takedown just kind of on the facts of the arguments DOJ made in trying to dismiss the case, the brief comes flat out and says, it just basically says what DOJ is doing is corrupt and politically motivated, which I thought was impressive that they didn't pull their punches that way, because that is absolutely what is happening. And that is the kind of language from someone who used to sit on the bench, a former judge. This isn't any it's not any just regular advocate off the street here. This is a former judge asked to look into this by a sitting judge. That ought to give the circuit, it ought to give the DC Circuit pause. But I think that this panel's, I think this is cooked. I think they know what they want to do. I think the way they've acted in this case, they didn't have to take this right away. I think they have their mind made up, but I don't think the full circuit will eventually agree, I suspect.
Do we have, is the panel selected just in like the normal
yeah, it was random
spins?
Yeah,
that's fucking bullshit. Sorry, like and that, I'm just going to say that from having been on the Second Circuit, and like there's empirical evidence. I think it's like Marta Sen at Harvard Kennedy School has written about this extensively, about showing that like the panel circuits like are not on circuit courts are not actually random. And one of the things that I really mean, like, and maybe this will end up mattering, I don't think that they're skewed typically in terms of like you get to pick who you want on your panel, but the circuit, like a lot of the judges make it very well known who they will not sit with and who they do not want to sit with on a panel, which then changes, like if you randomly pull one person out, it changes like the resulting algorithm of who the next couple of people are going to be. And so like while the first pick might be actually random, like after that you really skew the set of how these, and I feel like this is underexplored, both empiric, I mean, Marta's like paper is great. Like, but I think that this is totally like, I don't know. I'm not saying that I think that they put conservative people on the panel. I'm saying that they could have genuinely picked someone one of them randomly out of a bucket, and that skews the rest very strongly.
So, Matt, when you, I have in one way or another covered the Justice Department since 1994. And I have never, it's not just that I've never seen anything like this administration. I've never seen anything within like 100 miles of this administration. So I want to ask you an uncomfortable question, which is, when you were at the Justice Department, what was the thing that you were involved with that you thought, wow, this is edgy, maybe we shouldn't go there? And I want to hold that up next to like where you felt the line was, where you were like, we got to be careful here. We're dancing in some uncomfortable territory. I want to hold that up next to, ordering the dismissal of a case against the president's friend, or ordering a case withdrawal of a sentencing motion, or clearing Lafayette Square with tear gas, right? Like what's the, like, if we say like the Eric Holder era, the time you were at Justice, what's the thing that you were doing that you were like most uncomfortable with?
It's funny because it's anything that I can think of isn't even in the same ballpark. And
well, that's kind of my point. But just highlighting how far it is.
Yeah, let me give a short intro to that, which is when I got to the Justice Department in January of 2009. Remember the context. So the Justice Department a couple of years previously had a complete, what looked like then like a complete and utter meltdown, total politicization of the department. The Attorney General, Alberto Gonzales, had to resign over, there were a number of scandals: politicization of civil rights, politicization of hiring, but the big one was firing several US attorneys. And so we came into the department, all of us, and I was probably the most political person at DOJ. I came out of the campaign world, but very, I think came in with the mindset that we need to be so careful, just looking at what happened at the administration. And then you quickly, this is the thing I think people from outside DOJ world don't get. You quickly, even a political person like me, you come into the department and there's such a culture there that everything is supposed to be by the book and you're not supposed to pay attention to politics. And you're supposed to follow regular order and process, and all that matters, that it's very hard to get anywhere close to what's happened the last few years. Something I can think of that is, well, I'll say two things. One, early on, we had this issue where there was a question, I think it came from the White House, about DC statehood. And I don't remember the exact, I don't remember if it was whether Congress could do it on its own, but there was a question about DC statehood, and OLC had weighed in, and the Attorney General, Eric Holder, went to the then acting Solicitor General, Elena Kagan, had not been confirmed yet, and asked him his opinion. And he gave a different opinion that would have been more politically acceptable to.
This was Neil Katyal.
It was Neil, yeah, the administration. Yeah. And,
wait, he'd been this is after or during? What was it? Solicitor General?
While he was acting Solicitor General.
This was like,
yes,
yeah. This wasn't when he became acting after Elena went on the court. This was before she was confirmed. He was acting for a few months. This is early in March or something of 2009.
And as I recall, OLC had David Barron had basically he'd given a very uncomfortable opinion for the administration.
That's right. And so the Attorney General asked Neil his opinion. He gave had an opposite conclusion. The Post found out about it. dinged us, the editorial board. I don't know if you were still writing editorials then.
I believe I wrote
written,
that editorial.
You probably wrote. I say you probably wrote the
editorial.
editorial.
Oh no!
Really?
Wait a minute. That's not right. I was no longer there.
This was 2008.
Right. I was already at Brookings then. Sorry, that was not me.
So it might have been Ruth. Might have been Ruth Marcus. Somebody wrote an editorial dinging us, and we sort of pulled back, and it was, and that's a fairly fairly benign instance in terms of how the department can be politicized. Another one, deciding not to defend the Defense of Marriage Act in court.
Right.
Very controversial internally. I say very controversial. It wasn't that controversial internally, but there was a fight over it. And there are people in DOJ world that would say you always have to defend the statute no matter what. And I think we had very good reasons, but obviously that was a place where the administration had a political outcome, and we made a legal conclusion that happened to match what the political outcome the administration had in mind. But I think it was justified. But that is a sort of policy meets law thing that's fairly typical. There's never anywhere where we were going around dismissing cases. We're fairly lucky in administration where the president's top advisors weren't winding up in court all the time. But there's just nothing like this at all.
I got slapped down pretty hard, and I think it was rightfully so, in which I basically said something similar. I don't know if Ben said this. He probably didn't. But when all of this was happening and the Flynn thing had just happened, I was like, well, how is this different than the Attorney General firing scandal? That's exactly what I compared it to, and kind of that thing. And Ben was like, it's just completely batshit. It's absolutely, people kind of said that it was completely batshit with the Attorney General hiring scandal. But I think now that this is actually especially
different
in service
league.
What do you say?
Different league.
I said it's a different league.
No, and I totally see it as that. But you've followed this much more closely than I have. I've been off in my internet governance platform world for the last couple of years. So I honestly didn't follow it that closely. And I was like, how bad is this? And coming back into it, and it was yes. And now that I've read myself back in, I'm okay, this is actually really, really atrocious.
I mean, but I think your point is interesting, Kate, that if you're not somebody who's steeped in the traditions of the Justice Department,
which is 95% of Americans?
Oh, many more, much more than that, right? Explaining to somebody why what Bill Barr is doing is not just political, but is radically different from even the scandalous behaviors of prior administrations, right? It's on a different spectrum, is actually really hard. And that's because the rules are not, they're not written, they're not, it's a very kind of, it's a very subtle kind of normative behavioral set of expectations that I think people who have lived in it in one way or another are really sensitive to, but explaining what the rules are precisely without caveating it 1,000 times right away is really hard. That said, dismissing a case because the guy's a friend of the president's and lying about the reason and constructing a record that defames the FBI and the Justice Department, including currently serving officials. I mean, people think this is all about, Jim Comey and Pete Strzok, but it's also about, Brandon von Grack, the prosecutor who worked this case for Mueller and worked it until the day that Bill Barr wanted to file that memo when he withdrew himself from the case. And, Fox News is bent on destroying this guy's life now. That's it is not simply the list of people that you associate with this it's in a whole different orbit, but I'm always impressed by the fact that that actually requires explanation.
But like, why? Well, okay, so here's why. I will like, let me be a little bit more specific. A few weeks before the Flynn announcement about like him withdrawing his plea, there had been all these pardons, and I find pardons to be extra legal, and like we allow them because there's room for them in statute, and there's all
It's
of
in the
this.
Constitution.
I mean, it is in the Constitution, but it's garbage. Like it's garbage lack of due process, and just because it's in the Constitution does not mean that it's it's okay. And so like for me, I was like, oh, okay, you're okay with this. Like you're not okay with this outcome, ostensibly because the principle is different. But it's the same outcome as you just with like Blagojevich, that you just like were fine. Like people were like, okay, guess we have to deal with this.
See,
In the
I'm
Constitution.
totally not with you about this. I would be fine if Trump wants to pardon Mike Flynn. And actually, Gleason said this in the brief. Quinta Jurecic and I wrote it in the Atlantic a couple weeks ago, and then it shows up in Gleason's brief today. You know, this is a pardon by another means. And if you want to do a pardon, do the fucking pardon. Take the political heat. Write the document that says, I think what Mike Flynn did was fine. Donald J. Trump. You know, but don't contort the entire institution of the Department of Justice in order to do it. What do you think, Matt?
So I wouldn't be fine with a pardon, but I'd be much more fine with it because it would be a political choice by the president, and he would be willing to take the political heat. Presumably, he'd have to defend it at the ballot box. But I think the breakdown that's happening at the Justice Department, in some ways, is the same breakdown that lets the president get away with some of the things he does, including I think he would get away with a pardon, in that I don't think he would pay a big incremental political cost for it. And the breakdown is that I think this is all of these kind of controls on how DOJ can behave, and controls separately on how the president can behave, including pardoning his friends. There are norms, there are things that there's a political cost to violating them. And those norms have broken down because, and this is largely because the Republican Party no longer fears the kind of scandal that comes from the mainstream press. And so when you have someone like the president that is a creature of, is a creature of the conservative media, and his base is steeped in a conservative media, and then you get an attorney general who kind of has the same, I think, mindset. I don't believe that the president does things, or that Barr does things because the president wants them. I think he independently wants to do the things that the president wants him to do, because he comes out of the same kind of right-wing ecosystem. And I think what's happened
surprising everyone, right? Because a lot of people freaking like went to bat for him, and I was like, I don't think this guy's going to be that great. And like everyone was like, no, he's a real deal. And I was like, no.
So my theory on Barr is he has always been a complete right-winger, but fine. Lots of people are right-wingers and still believe in the rule of law, and still, will behave appropriately in office, but that he has had his brain kind of rotted by years of watching Fox and started to believe a lot of this stuff. And that gets back to the point I was making,
right.
Which then when you're in office, he both believes these very conservative, has these very, this conservative ideology he's had forever, sort of authoritarian instincts, is highly competent in terms of running the government, and doesn't have the disincentive to do the things he wants to do because he's not worried about mainstream media controversy. It's not a check on him the way it's been on past attorneys general. And that comes from just, the sort of, that's a breakdown that's applying. We're seeing it more and more. We're seeing it really come to light in this presidency. It's a check that's been removed across the administration, and it happens at DOJ too.
I think that's exactly right. And I think Barr, I knew him a number of years ago, and I always found him a very smart lawyer, definitely a right winger, but somebody who was always careful with what the law allowed. And whenever we would chat, it would be about, technical points of law and some of the big themes that they suggested. And I never had the sense that there was this lurking conspiratorial mindset there. And I think that's changed in the last few years. So we've got some good questions lined up. Jakob Heher, I hope I'm pronouncing your name right, and I hope your microphone works today.
All right, I'm going to give it a try. Can you hear me?
Indeed.
Yeah.
Lovely. Third time's the charm. So from listening to rational security in the past, it always seemed to me like Judge Sullivan granting this motion to dismiss, maybe with prejudice, maybe without, maybe grumpily, maybe getting a bunch of briefs beforehand. But in the end, the motion to dismiss being granted seemed like a foregone conclusion. Now, in light of the brief today, which I've skimmed, it seems to me like Sullivan might now have the cover he needs to maybe go along with what the brief's conclusions suggest and deny this motion and sentence Flynn. This then goes to appeals and whatnot. But what I'm trying to get an idea of is, how does this impact other DOJ prosecutions, legitimate prosecutions, you could maybe say, where the department is actually acting in good faith? Does this somehow shake up how the courts view statements the government makes? And does this would this also extend to future DOJs? Let's say hypothetically we have President Biden in a year. Would it impact the next DOJ? Would this just shake up this presumption of regularity that the government enjoys fundamentally? Or is this like such an outlier case that it can't be generalized to other cases, period?
It's a great question. Matt, give your thoughts, and then I'll add a couple thoughts.
I was kind of with you on your first question, that I thought that Sullivan was going to put the government through its paces, maybe do a little investigating of his own, maybe call some people from DOJ in and may put them on the record, but ultimately would dismiss the case. And after doing a quick read of the brief today, I'm not so sure I agree with it anyway. It makes a compelling case for sentencing General Flynn. In terms of the harms to the Justice Department, I think there is a carryover effect for people not thinking that the department is acting in good faith. And I wouldn't say it's just with judges; it's with jurors, it's with witnesses in criminal cases, it's with people the FBI wants to come interview. There are ramifications all throughout the legal system for people not believing that DOJ is necessarily acting in good faith. But I think the question, to get to your last point, is let's say Joe Biden wins, what happens when there is a Democratic Attorney General? Do we just, pop back into place with we go back to the norms, the pre, Donald Trump, Bill Barr norms, and DOJ acts the way it has before? I suspect that's the case. I have this terrible theory that the way DOJ is going to work from now on is that when Democrats are in power, it is going to operate independent from the White House, and it is going to operate the way it always has. And when Republicans are in power, it's going to get worse and worse and worse. Because if you look at the history of DOJ, from Mitchell to Meese to Gonzalez to Barr, you can see the kind of the DOJ norms eroding over time when Republicans are in power. And I don't think, I hope I'm wrong, I don't think they're going to snap back the next time there's a Republican president.
Is that typical? Like, do you or is this, and not to be like the huge, let's look back in history every time that we have these questions, but Nixon had a really hard time with this, and it snapped back to a certain extent. And do you think that this is kind of this actually seems like a Jack Goldsmith point, about kind of the permanent change in norms around a body that checks the president.
Yeah, that norm was put into place after Nixon, and I think you've seen, like I said, erosion of it. The politicization of DOJ under George Bush, we thought was, a massive scandal and unprecedented, and the kind of thing we wouldn't see again in our lifetime. And to the point Ben made earlier, what we're seeing now is an order of magnitude worse, 10 times, 100 times. I have no idea. And the point I guess I'm making is I don't think it's just a DOJ question. I don't think the Republican Party is committed to these norms as it used to be. And so I think the Republican Party post-Trump is not going to snap back to being committed to the rule of law the way it was before Donald Trump. I think there's going to be an erosion, and I hope I'm wrong, but I don't think we go back that easily.
No, so I agree with that, but I think it's really important to isolate the reason. There are, of the 2,000 or so DOJ former prosecutors who signed a statement denouncing Barr's brief in the Flynn case, quite a number of hundreds of them are Republicans, and they won't be for long. And part of the issue is that the Republican Party is deserting these norms, and part of the issue is that the people who believe in these norms are deserting the Republican Party. I am not a good example of that because I was never a Republican, but I'm as somebody who's committed to those norms, there's really only one party you can look to at this point. And so I'm sort of an example of that. I'm also not a prosecutor.
Don't tell Bill Kristol that, by the way. He's coming on tomorrow.
No, but Bill agrees with me, and we can talk to him about this. I mean, and he said recently, I don't think I can go back to working with Mitch McConnell. And that's a big statement for somebody like Bill, like that there are these lines that these people crossed, that if you believe in certain pre-political democratic norms, it's very hard to work with somebody after they do that. It's very hard to identify yourself. So Bill will still identify himself as a Republican, but he won't identify himself with any of the leadership of the Republican Party.
Ben, let me ask you a question real quick. I mean, the one way to think about this is Josh Hawley, a fairly mainstream Republican politician, former Attorney General of the state of Missouri. Let's say, Tom Cotton gets elected president and Josh Hawley is his Attorney General. Do you think he is going to run the Justice Department the way that John Ashcroft did, or is he going to be much closer to Bill Barr?
Right, and here's another way to say it. Right, 5 years ago, if you had said, who's an ideal kind of perfect Republican Attorney General who stands in the highest traditions of the Justice Department, you and I might both have said, "Oh, Chuck Rosenberg," right? Now, there is zero chance that Chuck Rosenberg would be named. He might be named, Attorney General or Deputy Attorney General by a Democratic president.
Right.
I would say there's like a 2% chance of that. There's a 0% chance he would be named by a Republican president. And so I think it's a flight from the norms by Republicans, and I agree with you. Josh Hawley is a great example of that. And this is somebody who clerked for the Chief Justice of the United States, and there's a flight from the Republican Party by people who believe in the norms. Just a quick thought on the question. There is a point on which the Gleason brief skates that will be more important to the DC Circuit, even a reasonable DC Circuit panel, than it is to Gleason and maybe to Sullivan. And that's that there's some pretty strong language in some of the DC Circuit precedents that this 48A, Rule 48A permission is really all about repetitive serial harassing prosecutions. And there was a recent case written actually by Judge Srinivasan, who's now the chief judge of the DC Circuit, and by the way, an Obama appointee, that is alluded to in the brief. It's a case called Fokker. And there's some very strong language in there. It is dicta. And so I think it's possible that Judge Sullivan can thread that needle. But I also think, he may have a sober night where he looks at the case law and says, geez, there's no way I'm going to be upheld if I refuse to let this case get dismissed. And And I think so he may have the gumption to do it anyway, but I do think the DC Circuit is likely to look askance at that. So
before we go to Kevin, really quickly.
Yeah.
Sorry, Ben. I didn't mean to cut you off.
Sorry. No, go ahead.
Before we get to Kevin really quickly, I just kind of want to follow up on this idea. Like, I see everything that you're saying about kind of like the next, like the Tom Cotton, Josh Hawley, but like, isn't this to a certain extent a new era of politics in which people are looking to lock in the 38% that Trump identified, like, and see that as like the winner's circle. And it's not about party politics necessarily, which is actually maybe like in the long run a good thing that we finally split things off or do something. But like, I don't know. That's actually, but I think that both Hawley and Cotton are making a run for that. And they want, like, it's not about any, like, they're not Republican. Like, I don't actually think that is, do you really think Hawley is like a mainstream Republican? Like, I don't know. I just grew up in a very different type of Republican, Rockefeller Republican, like middle America Republican type of family. The things that he espouses socially, like, would never fly. I don't know, but like, maybe I'm wrong.
What do you think, Matt? Are they the future?
Yeah, no, look, I think, look, the voters are going to decide, but I think Josh Hawley was, and probably in the core of himself is, a kind of John Roberts Republican, but has made a calculation that where the future of the Republican Party is, the future of the Republican Party is not Paul Ryanism. It's not, there's no constituency for that. And so the future is a kind of Trumpism without the chaos and the
lowbrowness.
I was about to say illiberalism, but I'm not sure that's exactly right.
There's not like even a word for it.
The lowbrow, so. Without the Trumpiness that comes around it, but the populism, the faux populism. I think in Hawley's case, I think he's making a bet that that's where the market is, and that's a way to win kind of white working class voters and get a majority of the Republican Party that maybe then gets you to 270 electoral votes in a good cycle.
Kevin Donohue, the floor is yours.
Hi, Matt. So earlier you were talking about the norms and guidelines within the Department of Justice that are not kind of written down. And thinking back to the Mueller investigation, 3 people who violated those norms, to my understanding, were McCabe, Rosenstein, and Comey. Thinking about those 3 people, who do you think, whose violations were the most harmful, and in order, if you could rank them 1 through 3? Thanks, Matt.
McCabe, Comey, and Rosenstein. So let's assume the worst. So I think Comey's I don't think I would say Comey violated a bunch of norms or really did anything, I think, even inappropriate in his handling of the Mueller investigation. I take great issue with what he did in 2016 with respect to the Clinton investigation. I've written and talked about this quite a bit. McCabe, I think McCabe's problem is if you believe the worst about him, he didn't tell the truth. Which isn't really a norm violation. It's just kind of a basic violation of FBI rules. And then Rod, I'm sort of meandering all over the place because I'm not sure how to rank them. Rod, I think, was more, it's never any one thing with Rod. I think Rod's biggest issue was always being weak when you needed him to be strong, and slowly, and I'll say he did some very good things. He appointed Mueller and he protected him for, a couple of years, I think a year and a half or so, until Barr was appointed and took over control of it. But at times, I think, allowed sort of public discourse around the investigation to get out of hand, didn't defend him, didn't defend the people there. And I think the worst thing he did was standing with Barr when Barr kind of came out before the report was released and put his take on it. So I think I'm not answering your question, but that's because I think they're sort of transgressions as they were are all of very different categories.
So we have a question from
You're not going to do a take on that one, Ben?
I mean, look, what I will say is about this is I actually agree with you. The nature of the allegations about the three of them are completely different, right? So McCabe is accused of lying about a matter ancillary to anything that anybody really cares about, but lack of candor in the FBI is a really fucking big deal. And so if those allegations are true, that is a big problem. Now, I took those allegations very seriously at the time that the IG made them, and I have been a little bit chastened. I don't know how chastened, a little bit chastened at least about them, because the more they pursued them criminally, the more it fell apart. And I've also, I don't think this is a big secret, you know, the New York Times has reported that the grand jury heard from Lisa Page, and the grand jury's, who was a principal witness to these events, and the grand jury refused to return an indictment. And so I do worry in the McCabe case that the basic allegations are very serious if true. And I worry that there may be more to the story than is in the IG report. So that's McCabe. With respect to Rosenstein, I'm less friendly to him than Matt is at this point. I think he has tried to be all things to all people. I cannot forgive him the release of the Struck Page emails, which I think was just a terrible thing to allow to happen. And particularly the way he did it, which was to call in, have a bunch of reporters called in the middle of the night and give them to them on the basis that they couldn't say that they came from the Justice Department, struck me as pretty dishonorable. I also think he did, I do think his conduct in the run-up to the Comey firing was also dishonorable. And that leaves the question of Comey, who is, look, a personal friend and somebody I care about. And Matt will back me up on this. There are exactly two people who raised the problems with what Comey did in closing the Clinton investigation in July of 2016. One of them was Matt Miller, and the other was me. And so I've never been comfortable with it. I am less convinced it was unforgivable than Matt is. But I do think, look, Jim is a big boy and he gets a lot of criticism for that. And he's going to continue for the rest of his life. And that is a decision he made that he has to be accountable for, whatever people think of it. Is that fair, Matt?
Completely.
So I want to raise, we're running out of time, but I want to, this is a question that comes from somebody I'm only going to identify as a deep state conspirator. And this person wants to know what you know about the history of endless investigations of the investigators.
I mean, it's not really how it used to happen. Look, I mean, I say it's not how it used to happen, but it's not unprecedented for when something goes wrong at the department, when there's kind of an internal car crash, for there to be an investigation. The inspector, that's what the inspector general is there for. What I think is unprecedented is what's happening now, where every time an investigation ends with an outcome that's adverse to the president's interests, either failing to prosecute someone or prosecuting someone, the attorney general comes in and finds a new U.S. attorney to go in and take a look at that and see whether it was handled appropriately. That, I think, is completely unprecedented. There's nothing like that in the history of the department.
Well,
and how do you understand John Durham's role? I mean, I am not either somebody who, you know, reifies John Durham or somebody who will demonize him. but his current role seems very odd to me. As best as I can tell, he hasn't interviewed any of the major figures involved in this. He's the Attorney General is out there, including most recently last night or this morning on Fox News, kind of teasing what he's going to find in this very, like, commenting on a pending investigation kind of way. How do you read the Durham investigation?
It is such a good question. So when he was appointed, you think, well, a U.S. attorney is conducting a criminal investigation. Then it seemed like it wasn't criminal for a while. Then DOJ made clear that it was a criminal investigation, although I think that just may mean parts of it are criminal. He may be looking at a leak. I think he is looking at the FBI, I think an analyst who falsified information in the Carter Page FISA application. But that's not the things that Barr really cares about. What he really cares about is trying to get, I think Brennan and Clapper and some of the other, deep state conspirators. And it's not clear to me that part is criminal, because I think the point you make, Ben, is right, that the big, kind of bold-faced names, I'm not sure have done interviews. And if they haven't done interviews, I assume that's because Durham is not able to compel them into a grand jury. I think it's worse than that, Matt. I mean, I don't want to name any names here just because but I think it's not I know a lot of these people. I don't know anyone who's even been contacted. Same.
It's not a question of like they've all declined to give voluntary interviews and he doesn't have a grand jury, so he can't compel him. They've had no contact.
There are some people I know he's tried to contact, and their answer has been, "Screw you! I'm not participating in this. Send me a subpoena," and he hasn't, which makes me think he doesn't. At least in that part of the investigation, he doesn't have a criminal predicate. He can't use a grand jury. Where he's going, I know where Bill Barr wants to go. I think he'd love to charge people, and barring that, he'd love to write a report before the election that really nails a bunch of Trump antagonists. And I'll say one thing about Durham. So I know Durham. Holder appointed him to look into a couple of torture cases from the Bush administration, and he seemed to me a completely honorable guy, a real hard charger. But there have been a couple
lot of
instances,
years to resolve those cases, though.
It took a long time, and it was because he was a hard charger. He's a hard ass, and he was, well, I don't think I can say why, because I think it's probably still grand jury information. But he's a hard ass. But he's done a couple things in this case that are really concerning. I think there's a statement, I won't go into, it's complicated, we're a short time. There's a statement he put out that really, really concerned me about his neutrality.
Yep. Lauren, the last question is yours, but you got to unmute yourself.
Okay, I'm muted. Everybody says Trump will not leave when he loses, because I'm going to be positive here. But whether he physically leaves the White House, why would that matter? Don't all the powers and the guy with the nuclear suitcase and everything automatically transfer to Biden, and he can go to Camp David or somewhere else till Trump gets tired of not having people pick up after him?
So it's a good question. Matt, how concerned are you about Trump refusing to accept the results of the election, and what precisely is the concern?
So I think if he loses, if one of two scenarios happens, either one, he loses decisively and there's no way to dispute it, or two, it's somewhat disputed, but the Supreme Court rules in a way that is firm that Joe Biden won the election. I don't think it really matters whether Trump accepts it or not. I think the Secret Service will march him out the door on noon on January 20th. What worries me is an election that's close, that's disputed, where there is a gray area, and there's either not a Supreme Court resolution in time, although that's hard to imagine, but some sort of gray area where there's a dispute over election in one or multiple states, and he refuses to leave. And I worry that in that scenario, the Republican Party will align with him and won't tell him to get out. That's the scenario that concerns me.
Yeah, I would just add to that there was an issue that arose in 2000 during the Bush v. Gore controversy of state legislatures, in that case, Florida, Republican-controlled state legislature, just appointing its own slate of electors. And that is probably within the constitutional authority of the state legislature. And you could imagine sort of mischief happening between November 4th and January and the time the Electoral College meets in December, in which something like that could happen under the right set of or the wrong set of circumstances. But I agree with the caller with Lauren that it doesn't actually matter if he refuses to acknowledge it, if he can't persuade anyone else in the hierarchy to back him in that regard. Matt Miller, thank you so much for joining us. It's good to see your face. Like, I'm used to seeing you in the green room at MSNBC, and it's like been a long time.
This is the pandemic version of that. So good to see you too. Thanks for having me.
It was so great to meet you, Matt. Thanks for backing up my Swiss Family Robinson story.
Absolutely. Hadn't thought about them in a long time, so glad to bring that back.
Yeah, it's kind of fun, right? I think that there is you have to be nostalgic, because it's really hard to go look towards the future right now. So it's like much nicer to like look back and just kind of reminisce.
Yeah. Amen.
So we will be back tomorrow at 5 with Bill Kristol. I think I will do the monologue tomorrow. I can't tell you what it'll be about. It will not be about Swiss Family Robinson. And until then, Kate, what do we say?
In lieu of, we can't have fun anymore. So in lieu of fun, we try to believe in the DOJ.
Boy, that's dark.
I know.
See you guys tomorrow.